Today's Bible study begins part 1 of our in-depth series on tithing in the Bible. In this opening episode, we will explore the origins of tithing and the full system of tithes instituted under the law of Moses. This study will trace the concept of tithing from its earliest mentions in Genesis to its full implementation under the Mosaic covenant, laying the foundation for the rest of the series. We will be using the ESV, or English Standard Version, translation for all scripture references. Let's start at the very beginning. The first recorded instance of a tithe is in Genesis chapter 14, when Abram, later known as Abraham, returns from rescuing his nephew Lot from a coalition of kings. After his victory, he encounters Melchizedek, the king of Salem and priest of God Most High. Genesis chapter 14, verse 18 through 20 says, "And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him a tenth of everything." This act of giving a tenth or tithe was entirely voluntary. There is no command from God to do this, and there is no indication it was part of a larger system. It appears as a spontaneous expression of gratitude and reverence. Some scholars believe this tithe may have been a cultural custom during times of victory or blessing, but what makes it important in the biblical context is that it is given to Melchizedek, a priest of God Most High. This moment becomes significant in the New Testament when the book of Hebrews references Melchizedek and Jesus as being of the same priestly order. The second mention of tithing is found in Genesis chapter 28. After Jacob flees from Esau and has a dream of a ladder reaching to heaven, he makes a vow to God. Genesis chapter 28 verses 20 to 22 says, "Then Jacob made a vow, saying, If God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God, and this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will give a full tenth to you." Again, this tithe is voluntary. Jacob makes a personal commitment to give a tenth of what he receives from God. There is no command issued from heaven, no instructions, no established pattern. These two examples in Genesis show that the idea of giving a tenth existed before the law, but they were acts of individual devotion, not legal obligations. Tithing as a command begins in the law of Moses. The formal system of tithes was instituted for the nation of Israel as part of the covenant God made with them at Mount Sinai. This system was far more complex than simply giving 10% once a year. There were actually 3 distinct tithes in operation under the law. The first and most frequently referenced tithe is the Levitical tithe. This is outlined in Numbers chapter 18 verses 21 to 24. "To the Levites I have given every tithe in Israel for an inheritance in return for their service that they do, their service in the tent of meeting, the tithes of the people of Israel, which they present as a contribution to the Lord, I have given to the Levites for an inheritance." The Levites were one of the 12 tribes of Israel, descendants of Levi, but unlike the other tribes, they were not given land as an inheritance. Their inheritance was the Lord himself and their role in the religious service of Israel. They were responsible for maintaining the tabernacle and later the temple, offering sacrifices, and handling many spiritual duties. Because they had no land, and thus no regular income from farming, they were supported by the tithes of the other tribes. This tithe was mandatory. Every Israelite was required to give a tenth of their agricultural produce, livestock, and other increase to the Levites. The Levites, in turn, were required to offer a tenth of what they received to the priests, known as the tithe of the tithe, as described in Numbers chapter 18, verses 25 to 28. The second tithe is known as the Festival Tithe. This is found in Deuteronomy chapter 14, verses 22 to 27. "You shall tithe all the yield of your seed that comes from the field year by year, and before the Lord your God in the place that he will choose, to make his name dwell there. You shall eat the tithe of your grain, of your wine, and of your oil, and the firstborn of your herd and flock, that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always. This tithe was different in purpose. It was not given to the Levites, but used by the individual families themselves during national religious festivals. They would travel to the designated place of worship, later established as Jerusalem, and use the tithe to celebrate before the Lord. This tithe encouraged joy, community, and the remembrance of God's blessings. If the distance was too great to carry the physical goods, the passage allows for converting the tithe to money, travelling to the place of worship, and using the funds to buy food, drink, and whatever the family desired for the celebration. The third tithe is often referred to as the poor tithe or the tithe for the needy. This tithe is mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 14 verses 28 and 29. At the end of every 3 years you shall bring out all the tithe of your produce in the same year and lay it up within your towns. And the Levite, because he has no portion or inheritance with you, and the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, who are within your towns, shall come and eat and be filled, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands that you do. Unlike the other 2 tithes, which were brought to the sanctuary or consumed during festivals, this tithe was stored locally and distributed to those in need. It provided for the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the foreigner living among the Israelites. This third tithe was only collected every 3rd year, making it less frequent but no less important. So, under the Mosaic Law, the Israelites were giving far more than a single 10%. If you calculate the first tithe annually, the second tithe annually for festivals, and the third tithe every 3rd year, the average Israelite could be giving around 23% of their increase across a 3-year period. This system ensured that the Levites were supported, the nation celebrated God's blessings, and the poor were cared for. It's important to understand that these tithes were specific to the covenant God made with Israel. They were agricultural in nature, reflecting the economy and lifestyle of ancient Israel. Tithes were given from the produce of the land, including grain, wine, oil, and livestock. There is no mention of tithing wages, currency, or other forms of income unrelated to agriculture. This is important because much of the teaching about tithing today applies the principle to monetary income in a modern context, which was not the original design. The tithing system also depended on the existence of the temple and the Levitical priesthood. The Levites could only function in their God-assigned roles if there was a temple to serve in. The storehouses where tithes were kept were physical rooms in the temple complex. Once the temple was destroyed in 70 AD and the Levitical priesthood ceased to operate, the system of tithing was effectively dismantled. In later parts of this series, we will examine how some of these ideas were carried over, or not carried over, into the New Testament. But for now, it is essential to understand the original structure and purpose of the tithe. It was never just 1/10. It was a structured system that served religious, communal, and charitable functions within ancient Israel. As we continue this series, we will dive deeper into how tithing was enforced, what the prophet said about neglecting the tithe, and how New Testament giving differs from this Old Covenant model. If you enjoyed this Bible study, make sure to like, subscribe, and drop a comment about what you think of this Bible study.